The sharp October wind cut through the dust of Red Hollow like a blade, seeking to scour away the shame. In that desolate New Mexico plaza, a young woman was about to discover that the price of dignity wasn't measured in dollars. Mercy Thorne kept her eyes fixed on the dry earth, her knees burning against the rough ground of the plaza. Her torn skirt fanned out around her like dead petals, as her father Silas shouted at the gathered crowd with the hoarse voice of a man who had already lost everything. $5. That's all I ask for this nameless girl. The men's laughter mingled with the whispers of women hidden behind their shawls. Mercy was a bastard, born of the shadows behind the saloon, with no inheritance or identity. To Silas, a failed rancher, she was just another useless mouth to feed. The end of a cycle without honor. The high plains wind carried the scent of dry hay and desperation. Mercy felt the stairs pierce her like thorns, but she never raised her head. She had long learned that shame was better endured with downcast eyes. She's worth less than a lame pony, Silas continued, spitting into the dust. But she cleans, cooks, sews, and she asks no questions. It was then that the crowd parted. The dull thud of heavy boots echoed on the beaten ground. A tall man in a worn duster emerged from among the curious onlookers, his hat pulled low, carrying the silence of one who had lived too much. His eyes were like cold iron beneath his furrowed brows. Mercy recognized that slow, measured stride. It was Jedediah Stone, the ex-gunfighter who had laid down his weapons after his wife's death. Everyone in Red Hollow knew his story. A man who had chosen silence over violence, solitude over sorrow. Without a word, Jedediah threw a leather pouch onto the makeshift table in front of Silas. Metal jingled in the tension-filled air. $10. And I don't need the change. Silas raised an eyebrow, surprised by the generous offer. You won't even look at what you're taking home? Jedediah's eyes fixed on Mercy for an instant, then returned to Silas with imperturbable coldness. I know exactly what I'm taking. Mercy was pushed to her feet like goods to be transported. In her trembling hands, she clutched a worn sack that held all she owned. Dry bread, a change of clothes, and an old medallion whose face was worn smooth by time. There were no hugs, no goodbyes, only dust rising beneath her bare feet. She climbed onto Jedediah's wagon with mechanical movements as if her body no longer belonged to her. The wood creaked under her weight as she settled onto the hard seat. The wind continued to blow relentlessly, carrying away the voices of the crowd who were already dispersing, disinterested now that the show was over. Jedediah took the reins without looking at her. His horses, two dun-colored mares, began their slow pace along the dusty road out of Red Hollow. The high plains sun beat down mercilessly, creating shimmering mirages on the horizon where the earth merged with the sky. The silence between them was thick as molasses. Mercy watched the landscape roll by. Spindly cacti, reddish rocks, and gnarled scrub brush that looked like the skeletons of once thriving plants. Every now and then, they encountered other souls along the road. Eastbound traders, settler families with wagons laden with hopes, solitary cowboys who barely tipped their hats in greeting. When she finally found the courage to break that wall of silence, her voice came out as a raspy whisper. Why did you buy me? Jedediah kept his eyes fixed on the track ahead, his hands steady on the reins. For a moment, Mercy thought he wouldn't answer, that this silence would become the soundtrack of her new life. But then, in a grave, measured voice, he said, My children need someone to stay, and I need someone who won't flee at the first storm. The words hung in the warm afternoon air. Mercy felt something stir in her chest, an emotion she couldn't identify. It wasn't gratitude, not yet, but perhaps it was the first sprout of hope she had ever felt. The wagon continued its journey through the arid lands of New Mexico, leaving behind a trail of dust that the wind hastened to erase. As if Mercy's past could really be swept away so easily, as if a new life could begin simply by changing direction on a dusty road. But Mercy knew things didn't work that way. The past has deep roots, and shame is a burden you always carry, even when you hope you've left it behind. They arrived at the ranch at sundown when the sky was tinged with orange and purple over the distant mountains. The house stood against the horizon like a dark silhouette. Not grand, but it had that solidity that spoke of deep roots and folks who knew how to weather storms. 4 pairs of eyes peered from the candlelit window. Mercy could make out their shapes. 3 boys of different ages and a small girl, with red hair like burning embers catching the sunset light. They were all huddled behind the fogged glass, curious and wary at the same time. Jedediah stopped the wagon in front of the creaking wooden porch and dismounted with slow, deliberate movements. He didn't offer Mercy help to get down, but neither did he treat her like cargo to be unloaded. He simply waited for her to find her own way, respecting the fragile dignity that remained to her. The house door opened and the 4 children emerged in single file, like cautious little soldiers. The eldest must have been about 14, with already broad shoulders and calloused hands from working in the fields. The other 2 were smaller, perhaps 8 and 10, with that restless energy typical of country boys. The little girl, who couldn't have been more than 6, hid behind her brothers, but her green eyes gleamed with curiosity. "Folks," Jedediah said in his grave, calm voice, "this is Mercy. She'll be staying with us." There were no grand introductions, no elaborate explanations. It was Jedediah's way, stating things as they were, without frills or false promises. The children observed her in silence, appraising her with that brutal frankness only the young possess. Mercy felt the weight of their gazes like stones on her chest. Her hand instinctively closed around the old medallion she wore around her neck, that small, faceless talisman that was the only thing connecting her to a mysterious past. The metal was warm against her skin, heated by the journey's sun. "Come on," Jedediah said, heading for the house. "Dinner won't make itself." The inside of the house smelled of seasoned wood and chimney smoke. The furniture was simple but solid, handcrafted with care and attention. The walls were bare, adorned only by some farm tools and a faded old photograph of a woman with a kind smile, probably Jedediah's deceased wife. Mercy looked around, trying to understand where her place was in all this. The children continued to stare at her, and she felt like an exotic animal in a cage. The high plains wind whistled through the window cracks, reminding her that no matter how far she had come, she was still the same nameless girl who had been sold in a dusty plaza. The following days were a trial by fire. Mercy burned dinner on the first day, turning the rabbit to a charred cinder that reeked of failure. She left the firewood out during a sudden rain, and the water in the bucket froze overnight because she'd forgotten to bring it inside. Each mistake was an added weight on her shoulders, a confirmation that perhaps Silas had been right. She wasn't even worth $5. The eldest boy, whom she discovered was named Abner, watched her with skeptical eyes as she struggled with daily chores. The twins, Gideon and Obadiah, whispered among themselves in hidden corners, and Mercy was sure they were talking about her. Only little Daisy seemed indifferent to her failures, continuing to play with her rag dolls as if nothing had changed. Jedediah never said a word about her mistakes. He didn't scold her when he found burnt bread, didn't shake his head when he discovered the wet wood. He simply fixed what could be fixed and started over, with that infinite patience Mercy couldn't understand. The high plains wind continued to blow relentlessly, carrying the scent of wild sage and the distant sound of coyotes howling at the moon. At night, Mercy lay on the small bed in the room Jedediah had prepared for her, a room that must have once been a storage closet, and listened to the settling sounds of the house. It was all so different from the chaos of the saloon where she'd grown up, where silence never existed. It was on the 4th night that everything changed. Mercy was woken by a faint moan coming from the next room. She rose barefoot, the floor cold under her skin, and followed the sound to the room where Daisy slept. The child was burning with fever, her red hair plastered to her sweaty forehead, her eyes closed but restless. Mercy didn't even think to wake Jedediah. Instinctively, she sat beside the little bed and began to do what she had seen the women of the saloon do when someone fell ill. Cool cloths on the forehead, small sips of water, gentle hands stroking hair. For 3 nights she stayed by Daisy's bedside, changing wet cloths and whispering forgotten songs that her mother, whoever she might have been, must have sung to her long ago. The words came naturally, as if they had always been hidden somewhere in her heart, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. The morning the fever finally broke, Mercy woke with her head resting on the child's bed. On the table beside her was a cup of warm milk and a note written in childish script. "Thank you." Unsigned, but heavy with meaning. For the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, Mercy truly smiled. After that night, something unlocked in the dynamic of the house. Mercy began to chop wood with Abner, who showed her how to properly swing the axe to conserve energy. Her hands grew calloused, but each precise strike was a small victory against the uselessness she had always felt herself to be. Gideon, the more introverted of the twins, taught her the secrets of the root recipes his mother had passed down before she died. How to prepare a willow bark decoction for aches, how to recognize good herbs from poisonous ones, how to make food last when winter grew harsh. His lessons were whispered, almost shy, but laden with an ancient wisdom that Mercy absorbed like a sponge. Obadiah, on the other hand, was the opposite of his twin brother. His jokes filled the strenuous moments, turning daily work into something that almost resembled fun. When Mercy stumbled over the milk buckets, he laughed so hard that even she couldn't help but join in. It was the first time Mercy had truly laughed, from deep in her gut, without shame or fear. Daisy, completely recovered, had fallen into the habit of following Mercy everywhere she went. Her small hands clung to Mercy's skirt as she did her chores, and in the evening she would only fall asleep if Mercy sang those mysterious songs that seemed to emerge from the deepest recesses of her memory. Jedediah observed all this from the porch, where he sat every evening carving small wooden toys with his knife. His expert hands transformed rough pieces of wood into horses, dolls, toy trains. Mercy watched him secretly, fascinated by the delicacy with which this man with such large hands could create such small, perfect things. One evening, as the family gathered around the fire after dinner, Mercy found the courage to say what had been burning in her chest for days. "You don't treat me like merchandise." Jedediah looked up from the piece of wood he was carving. The firelight danced on his etched face, creating shadows that told stories of pain and resilience. "Because you never were," he replied in his grave voice. "Sometimes what the world throws away is exactly what a home needs to be complete." Mercy felt something tighten in her throat. She instinctively touched the old medallion she wore around her neck, turning it between her fingers as she always did when emotions became too intense to manage. The metal was cold in the high plains evening, but it gave her a sense of anchorage, as if that small relic from the past could hold her steady in the present. The night wind carried the scent of sage and the distant hoot of an owl calling its mate. For the first time she could remember, Mercy felt part of something larger than herself. The days slipped into a routine that tasted of normalcy, something Mercy had never known before. She rose before dawn to light the fire, prepared breakfast while the children dressed, and then everyone went to their daily tasks. It was a silent, synchronized dance, where every movement had its place and its moment. One morning, as Mercy prepared bread in the cool morning air, Daisy approached her with that serious expression only children have when they're about to ask an important question. "Are you going to leave like the others?" the child asked, her green eyes full of a heartbreaking vulnerability. Mercy stopped, her hands still coated with flour. She had never thought there had been others before her. Daisy's question opened a wound she hadn't known existed, revealing how many times this family had hoped for someone to stay, only to be abandoned again. Mercy knelt to be at the child's eye level. Her hands, still white with flour, rested gently on Daisy's small shoulders. "No, sweetheart," she said with a firmness that surprised her. "I came to stay." The smile that lit up Daisy's face was like the sun breaking through after a storm. The child threw her arms around Mercy's neck with such force that Mercy swayed, but she held her tight, feeling for the first time in her life the wonderful weight of being needed by someone. But the tranquility of those days was not meant to last. As often happens in life, just when we begin to believe that happiness can be permanent, fate reminds us how fragile every beautiful thing we build is. One morning, the sound of wheels on the dusty road broke the dawn silence. Mercy, who was hanging laundry, looked up and saw an elegant carriage approaching the ranch. It wasn't the kind of vehicle often seen in those desolate lands, too refined, too out of place. Jedediah emerged from the barn, his hands still dirty with hay, and stopped to watch the carriage pull up to the porch. The children instinctively gathered around him, like small animals sensing danger in the air. From the carriage stepped an impeccably dressed man, followed by two other rougher-looking individuals. The elegant man had perfectly combed hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. Mercy felt a shiver run down her spine, though she didn't yet know why. "Mr. Stone," the man said in a mellifluous voice, "I am Latham Blackwood, son of your old friend Beauregard Blackwood." Mercy saw Jedediah stiffen imperceptibly. That name meant something to him, and not something good, judging by the shadow that crossed his face. The High Plains wind blew stronger than usual that morning, as if even nature sensed that something was about to change forever. Latham Blackwood advanced toward Jedediah with the confidence of one accustomed to always getting what he wanted. Behind him, the two men remained by the carriage. One carried a lawyer's brief, the other had the rough appearance of a miner. "We've made an interesting discovery beneath your soil, Mr. Stone," Latham said with a painted smile. "Silver. A very rich vein, according to our geologists." Mercy felt Abner stiffen beside her. Even the children, though not fully understanding the situation, perceived the tension in the air like animals before a storm. "And according to the records," Latham continued, opening a document the lawyer handed him, "this land is still registered to my family. Without a recorded deed, Mr. Stone, I'm afraid you have simply occupied something that never belonged to you." Mercy saw Jedediah lower his eyes, and in that gesture she recognized the same shame she had felt when she knelt in the Red Hollow Plaza. For the first time since she had known him, this strong, silent man suddenly seemed fragile. "Your father gave me this land," Jedediah said in a hoarse voice. "A gentleman's agreement. A handshake." "Ah, but you see," Latham countered with false understanding, "handshakes mean nothing in the eyes of the law. And the law says this land is mine." The High Plains wind had grown more violent, raising clouds of dust that made the air unbreathable. Mercy realized she was clutching the medallion around her neck so tightly that the metal cut into her skin. "I'll give you until the end of the month to gather your things," Latham said, with theatrical magnanimity. "After that, my men will begin extraction work. If this story is moving you and you want to discover how Mercy will face this new challenge, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the continuation of this captivating Wild West saga." That night, Jedediah didn't come inside. Mercy saw him from the window, sitting on the porch steps with his rifle across his lap and an old blanket draped over his shoulders. A fine snow began to fall, but he didn't move an inch. It was his way of saying that no one would pass through him without a fight. Mercy brewed hot coffee and stepped out into the frigid night. She sat beside him on the wooden steps without saying a word. Jedediah accepted the steaming cup with a nod of thanks. "There was never a written deed," he finally admitted, his voice almost lost in the wind. "Just one man's word to another. But in those days, that was enough." Mercy nodded, though she knew times had changed. Now only documents mattered. Official stamps, the cold letter of the law. Honor and a given word were luxuries simple folk could no longer afford. "What will you do?" she asked. Jedediah took a sip of coffee, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. "I don't know yet, but I won't let them take everything without a fight." The days that followed were steeped in tension. Jedediah walked the ranch like a man living on borrowed time, checking every fence, every tool, every corner of the land he had called home for so many years. The children followed him in silence, unable to fully grasp what was happening, but intelligent enough to perceive that their lives were about to change drastically. Mercy tried to maintain the daily routine, preparing meals and doing chores as if nothing had changed. But it was impossible to ignore the shadow that lengthened over all of them. During the coldest hours of the afternoon, when the High Plains wind grew sharper, she found herself looking at the horizon, expecting to see other carriages arrive to take away everything they had built together. It was while she was trying to chop wood to keep the house warm that the accident happened. Jedediah, who usually handled the axe with a surgeon's precision, seemed distracted that morning, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. The blow missed its mark, and the blade slipped, striking his leg. Mercy heard his cry of pain from the yard and ran to him. She found him sitting on the ground, blood staining his pants and the axe fallen beside him. The wound wasn't deep, but serious enough to make it difficult for him to walk. "Let me help you," Mercy said, but Jedediah shook his head with stubborn pride. "It's nothing," he growled, though the pallor of his face said otherwise. But in the following days, it became clear it was not nothing. Jedediah struggled to move, and all the ranch responsibilities fell onto Mercy's and the children's shoulders. Mercy found herself having to do jobs she never imagined she could, feeding livestock, mending a broken fence, even attempting to fix the leaking roof. It was while she was struggling to chop a particularly tough log that the axe slipped from her sweaty hands. Pain struck her like lightning as the blade cut the palm of her left hand. Blood began to drip onto the snow, creating small red stains that spread like sickly flowers. With her bleeding hand wrapped in a cloth, Mercy headed to the barn in search of something to better bandage the wound. She was rummaging on a high shelf when, in her clumsy movement with one hand, she accidentally knocked over an old wooden box covered in dust. The box fell to the ground with a dull thud, and the lid opened, scattering its contents onto the barn floor. Mercy knelt to pick up the pieces, mentally apologizing to Jedediah for rummaging through his private belongings. But what she saw took her breath away. Among old receipts and documents yellowed with time, there was a thick envelope, sealed with red sealing wax. With trembling fingers, not only from the cold now, but from excitement, Mercy carefully opened the envelope. It was the original land deed, signed by Latham's father, sealed and stamped with a date and witnesses. An official, incontestable document, proving that Beauregard Blackwood had indeed deeded that land to Jedediah Stone. Mercy remained sitting on the hay for several minutes, the document in her trembling hands and the blood from her wound slowly staining the improvised cloth. If she hadn't known how to read, that piece of paper would have been just another yellowed sheet among the memories of a past life. But now, with her eyes scanning the lines written in faded but still legible ink, Mercy understood she held the future of the Stone family in her hand. The red sealing wax of the seal had preserved perfectly in the dry cold of the barn. The signatures were clear: Beauregard Blackwood on one side, Jedediah Stone on the other, and two witnesses who had put their initials next to the date. It was all legal, all official, all incontestable. Mercy rose with legs trembling from emotion and ran toward the house, clutching the document against her chest as if it were a precious treasure. The high plains wind whipped her face, but for once she felt no cold. She was only in a hurry to share the discovery. "Jedediah!" she cried as she burst into the house, forgetting good manners in her excitement. "Jedediah, you have to see this!" She found him sitting by the fireplace, his injured leg propped on a stool. The children were gathered around him as Gideon read aloud from an old storybook. All of them looked up when Mercy stormed into the room like a whirlwind. "What's wrong?" Jedediah asked, alarmed by the blood on the cloth around Mercy's hand and the wild expression in her eyes. Mercy placed the document in front of him without a word. Jedediah took it with hands that immediately began to tremble when he recognized the handwriting of his old friend Beauregard Blackwood. His eyes moved rapidly over the lines, reading and rereading as if he couldn't believe what he saw. "Where did you find this?" he asked in a hoarse voice. "In the barn. In an old box. It was there all along, Jedediah. It was there all along." Abner came closer to look at the document over his father's shoulder. "What does it mean?" he asked. "It means," Jedediah said, his voice growing in intensity with each word, "that this land is ours. Legally, officially ours." The next day, Mercy rode into town with the document hidden in her jacket. The cold was biting, but her steps were light as she crossed Red Hollow's main street toward the county clerk's office. The clerk, an elderly man with thick spectacles, examined the document with professional care. He turned it over, held it up to the light, checked the seals and signatures with a magnifying glass. "It's all here," he finally said with a smile. "Signed, sealed, and perfectly legal. The land definitively belongs to the Stone family." Mercy felt an enormous weight lift from her shoulders, but her joy was short-lived. When she returned to the ranch that evening, she found Latham Blackwood waiting on the porch with a new document in his hand and a smug smile on his lips. "Miss Mercy," he said in a mellifluous voice, "I see you took a little trip into town today, but I'm afraid your efforts were in vain." He pulled out a brand new sheet of paper. "This is a new deed, registered in the neighboring county. As you see, it's more recent than yours, and according to the law, the last registered document takes precedence." Mercy looked at the document Latham held and felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. Even without being a legal expert, she understood that this piece of paper represented a mortal threat to everything they had built together as a family. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "You know perfectly well that land belongs to Jedediah." Latham laughed. a clear, cruel sound that was lost in the high plains wind. My dear young lady, in business, there are no feelings. There is only what can be proven in a court of law. The sheriff, who had arrived with Latham, removed his hat with an embarrassed air. He was a man Mercy knew by sight, one of those who had witnessed her sail in Red Hollow's plaza without lifting a finger to stop that shame. "I'm sorry, Mr. Stone," the sheriff said, avoiding Jedediah's eyes. "The law is the law. Until this dispute is settled by a judge, the land is considered disputed territory." Disputed territory? Jedediah rose with difficulty, leaning heavily on the cane he had started using after the accident. "This has been my home for 15 years, and you may remain," Latham said with false magnanimity, "until the court has made a final decision. Of course, you must refrain from any improvements to the property. We wouldn't want you to waste energy on something that might no longer belong to you." When they left, leaving behind only dust and veiled threats, the Stone family gathered in the warm kitchen. The silence was heavy as a lead blanket. The children looked at their adults, seeking reassurances that no one seemed able to give. It was Daisy who broke the silence with her crystalline little voice. "Papa, what if the judge says we have to leave?" Jedediah picked her up, burying his face in her red hair so she wouldn't see the tears welling in his eyes. "I don't know, little one. I don't know." That night, Mercy couldn't sleep. She walked through the dark house, passing the rooms where the children slept restlessly, stopping at the window to watch Jedediah again standing guard on the porch despite his injured leg. Looking at the stars shining cold above the high plains, Mercy found herself touching the old medallion she wore around her neck. The metal was icy against her skin, but somehow it gave her strength. She had survived the shame of being sold like livestock. She had found a family that accepted her for who she was. She had discovered she was capable of loving and being loved. She wouldn't let all this be taken away from her without a fight. The next morning, an unexpected dispatch arrived. A boy on horseback delivered an elegant envelope addressed to Mercy. She opened it with trembling hands, wondering who could know her name and find her. The letter was written on costly paper with elegant handwriting that spoke of education and wealth. It was signed by a railroad attorney, and its words were poisonous honey that promised everything Mercy had never dared to dream of. Mercy read the letter 3 times before the words truly began to sink into her mind. The railroad attorney offered her everything she had never had: freedom, a new name, enough money to start a new life far from Red Hollow and the ghosts of her past. "Miss Thorne deserves more," the letter said with elegant, persuasive words. "Freedom, a respectable identity, enough money to start anew far from here. In return, simply sign away your claim to the property. Leave the Stone family to us. You've already done your part." It was everything Mercy had never dared to dream. Official documents recognizing her as a person, financial security, the chance to be someone instead of no one. All she had to do was abandon the only thing she had ever chosen in her life, the family she had learned to love. Mercy folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. She said nothing to anyone, but for the rest of the day, she moved as if in a trance. She prepared lunch mechanically, helped Gideon gather eggs, listened to Obadiah tell one of his funny stories without truly hearing the words. That evening, as the family gathered around the fire as they had so many times before, Mercy suddenly stood up. Everyone watched her as she walked toward the fireplace, the letter in her trembling hand. Without a word, she threw the paper into the flames. "I'm not for sale," she said, watching the fire devour the proposition. "I never was." Jedediah looked at her with eyes that shone with understanding and gratitude. He didn't ask what the letter was. He didn't need to know. The gesture was enough, the choice was enough. Later that evening, when the children had gone to bed, Jedediah sat beside Mercy on the porch. The high plains wind was less cold than usual, as if even nature was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. "I never told you," Jedediah said in a hoarse voice, his eyes fixed on the stars. "But I was abandoned too. A bastard, nameless, raised on a ranch where no one wanted to look me in the eye. The difference is I ran. You didn't. You stayed." Mercy felt something tighten in her throat. For the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, she truly understood why Jedediah had bought her that day. It wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. It was recognition. A wounded soul recognizing another wounded soul and offering it a home. "Why would I run?" Mercy asked. Here I found what I'd always sought without knowing what it was. "And what was that?" Mercy smiled. The first truly serene smile she had ever had. "A family that chooses me every day instead of just enduring me." The wind carried the scent of wild sage and the distant sound of a coyote calling its mate. In the distance, the mountains stood black against the starry sky, immutable witnesses to all the lives that had passed beneath them, to all the dreams that had been born and died in that harsh but generous land. Mercy knew the battle for the land wasn't over yet, but for the first time since the troubles began, she wasn't afraid. She had chosen her family, and her family had chosen her. Everything else was just paper and ink. That winter was the hardest the Stone family had ever faced, not only for the bone-biting cold and the snow piling against the windows, but for the constant tension of not knowing if that house would still be theirs with the arrival of spring. Mercy, Abner, and the boys worked together to keep the ranch alive. They chopped wood with hands cracking from the cold, cared for the animals when the water in the buckets froze before they could drink it, prepared meals with scraps and the roots Gideon knew how to find even under the snow. Jedediah continued to carve his small wooden toys, sitting by the fire with his injured leg aching on the coldest days. But now his carvings had a different meaning. They were like silent prayers, small works of art representing the hope that his family would remain united. Daisy often sat beside him, watching his expert hands transform rough pieces of wood into small masterpieces. One evening, as she watched a little horse emerge from his fingers, she asked, "Papa, if we have to leave, can we take your little horses with us?" Jedediah paused for a moment, then continued carving. "Wherever we go, little one, we'll take everything that truly matters with us." But Mercy knew that what truly mattered wasn't objects. It was the feeling of belonging to something, of being needed, of being loved not despite one's flaws, but including one's flaws. It was watching Abner grow more like his father every day, listening to Gideon teach Obadiah the secrets of medicinal herbs, seeing Daisy grow up confident in the love that surrounded her. The days shortened and the nights lengthened, but the family huddled around the fire and found warmth in each other. Mercy told stories she made up on the spot. Obadiah made everyone laugh with his impressions of the townspeople. Gideon brewed teas that tasted of home, and Abner played an old harmonica he had found in the attic. One particularly cold night, as the wind howled outside like a wounded animal, Mercy woke to find Daisy in her bed, curled up against her like a frightened kitten. "I'm scared," the child whispered. "I'm scared that when I wake up, you won't be here." Mercy held her tight, feeling the weight of that absolute trust that had been placed in her. "I'll always be here, sweetheart. I promise you. Even if the judge says we have to leave, even then. A family isn't made of walls and roofs, Daisy. It's made of people who choose each other every day." When spring arrived, it brought not only the thaw and the first wild flowers, but also the news everyone was waiting for. A messenger on horseback arrived one April morning, when the air smelled of new life and rekindled hopes. The district judge had finally reviewed all the documents. The decision had been made. Mercy and Jedediah looked at each other as the man dismounted, both trying to read the verdict that would determine their future in his face. The children gathered around them, forming a familiar circle that tightened in anticipation of knowing their destiny. The messenger opened his leather satchel and extracted an official document sealed with the district court's stamp. His hands trembled slightly, perhaps from the morning cold, perhaps from the weight of the news he carried. "Judge Thaddeus Crowley," he began in a solemn voice, "after reviewing all documents presented by the parties involved, has issued the following verdict." Mercy felt her heart pound so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Jedediah had placed a protective hand on Abner's shoulder, while the other children clung to each other like small animals seeking safety in the herd. "The land known as Stone Ranch," the messenger continued, "legally and morally belongs to the Stone family. The document presented by Mr. Latham Blackwood has been declared falsified and without legal validity." For a moment there was absolute silence, as if the entire world had held its breath. Then Daisy began to laugh, a crystalline sound of pure joy that spread like ripples in a pond. Gideon and Obadiah hugged, Abner smiled for the first time in months, and Jedediah closed his eyes as if thanking a silent deity. Mercy felt her legs give way beneath her and sat on the porch steps, her hands trembling with emotion. They had done it. They had won. The land, the house, the family. Everything was saved. The messenger left, leaving behind a transformed family. For the first time in months, the tension left their faces and shoulders. Jedediah went into the house and came out with a bottle of whiskey he kept for special occasions, though none of them had ever imagined a more special occasion than this. "To family," he said, raising the bottle in an improvised toast. "To family," they all responded in chorus, even the children who drank milk instead of whiskey, but with the same solemnity. That evening, while preparing dinner to celebrate the victory, Mercy was interrupted by a familiar sound. The thud of hooves on the dusty road. Her blood ran cold for a moment. Memories of the past never completely fade. But when she recognized the rider, she smiled. It was a familiar figure dismounting a tired horse. Silas, her father, thinner and more worn than she remembered, with dirty clothes and the air of a man who had hit rock bottom. "Well, Mercy," he called out in that voice she knew too well. "Heard you struck it rich. A right pitiful collection of strays, no, on a godforsaken ranch." But this time, Mercy didn't lower her eyes. She didn't feel the wave of shame that had always accompanied her father's cruel words. She dried her hands on her apron, stepped onto the porch, and looked him straight in the eye. "We're not strays," she said in a firm, clear voice. "We're chosen, and that's worth more than any name." Silas laughed, but it was a hollow laugh without strength. "Still the same proud child? Thought after all this time you'd learn your place." "I have," Mercy replied. "My place is here, with my family." Behind her, on the porch, Jedediah appeared. He said nothing, made no threatening gestures. He simply stood beside Mercy, and his silent presence said everything there was to say. She was no longer alone, no longer defenseless, no longer the nameless girl who could be sold for $5. Silas looked at Jedediah, then Mercy, then Jedediah again. Something in his gaze died, like a candle blown out by the wind. "Well," he said, remounting his horse, "suppose there's nothing left for me here." And he rode off, leaving behind only dust and memories that Mercy knew she could finally bury forever. A year later, Mercy found herself again on the ranch porch, but everything had changed. She was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived with a sack of rags and a faceless medallion. She had become the backbone of a family, the heart of a home that breathed love and belonging. The high plains wind still blew, but now Mercy no longer felt it as a threat. It had become the soundtrack of her new life, a constant melody that reminded her every day how fortunate she was to have found her place in the world. Abner, now 15, worked alongside his father with the pride of one who knows he is part of something important. The twins, Gideon and Obadiah, had grown, but still maintained that special camaraderie only brothers possess. Daisy, with her red hair gleaming in the morning sun, ran through the yard chasing chicks, her laughter filling the air with pure joy. Jedediah had returned to walking normally, though every now and then Mercy would catch him rubbing his leg on colder days. He continued to carve his small wooden masterpieces, but now he gifted them to the town children during festivals, spreading some of the happiness he had found in his own home. That particular morning, as Mercy hung the washed clothes, she saw a dust cloud approaching along the road. For a moment her heart stopped. Memories of the past never completely vanish, but when she recognized the buggy, she smiled. It was the town preacher, who came for the monthly visit he had begun making since learning that a family so united they had become a legend throughout the district lived at Stone Ranch. "Good morning, Mrs. Stone," he greeted, dismounting from the buggy. "Mrs. Stone," Mercy repeated to herself, still savoring the sound of that name she had chosen and that had chosen her. Jedediah had asked her to marry him 3 months earlier, in a proposal as simple as everything he did. "I reckon we ought to make official what we already are." The wedding had been held right there on the porch, with the children as witnesses and the high plains wind as a blessing. Mercy had worn a simple dress she had sewn herself, and around her neck she still wore her old medallion, no longer a reminder of a mysterious past, but a symbol of the entire journey she had traveled to get there. "Reverend Crowley?" Mercy replied. inviting him to sit in the shade of the porch. "How's your family?" As she prepared coffee and listened to the town news, Mercy reflected on how strange fate was. She had been sold like an object, treated as if she had no value, but she had ended up becoming the most precious treasure of a family that loved her for who she was, not for what she could have been. The High Plains sun began to set, painting the sky with those orange and purple hues that Mercy had learned to love. The children returned from their games, Jedediah came in from the fields, and the house prepared for another evening of family warmth. That night, as she got ready for bed, Mercy looked at herself in the mirror. The face reflected back was that of a woman who had found her way, who knew her own worth, who was loved, and who loved in return. She touched the old medallion around her neck one last time, now more a symbol of hope than of mystery. Then she gently kissed it and placed it on the nightstand beside the bed. She no longer needed it to remind herself who she was. Mercy Stone knew exactly who she was. A chosen woman, a beloved wife, a mother of 4 wonderful children, and the keeper of a home where the High Plains wind no longer carried shame, but only the promise of better days. If this story has moved and touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you are listening to this story from. Each of your messages is precious and helps me continue creating tales that can bring a little beauty into your days. Thank you for sharing this Wild West adventure with me, where we discovered together that a person's true worth is not measured in dollars, but in the love they can give and receive.